Greetings and welcome from the League of Women Voters of Portland. My name is Debbie Kay. I'm the League president. The League is dedicated to making democracy work. One of our core beliefs is that democracy functions best when voters are informed about the issues and engaged in their communities. For that reason, we present programs like this to give our Portland and Multnomah County neighbors an opportunity to think about the issues that affect our lives and the well-being of our communities. The League is grateful for support from the League of Women Voters of Portland Education Fund, the Carol and Velma Sailing Foundation, and Metro East Community Media. Metro East records our community education panels, voter education presentations, candidate and ballot measure forums, and video voters guide, and then rebroadcast them on community access channels, social media, and also makes podcasts for us. Please tell your friends, colleagues, and family to watch this video and podcast. They will be posted on our website, lwvpdx.org, on or about Friday, February 15th. We sincerely thank our speakers, the moderator, and the League volunteers who donate their time and expertise to bring these programs to you. The moderator for tonight's program is our esteemed colleague, James Offsink, a League member who leads our Justice Interest Group. He also serves Multnomah County taxpayers as Tax Supervising and Conservation Commissioner appointed by the Governor. But before I turn the program over to James, I'd like to introduce Trish Garner, who currently serves on our board of directors and also the Justice Interest Group. She is, in addition, the State Diversity Officer for the American Association of University Women of Oregon. Trish is retired from the practice of law, where she worked as a federal prosecutor and criminal defense trial attorney. She will give a brief overview of the League of Women Voters 2021 Police Oversight and Accountability Report. The League has been engaged with local police issues for many decades. At our annual meeting in early May 2020, we approved a new study on Portland police accountability. 2 weeks later, George Floyd was murdered. Through the rest of that year and into 2021, a team of volunteers researched and wrote our report, published in April of that year. We have used it to advocate for reforms ever since. The recent brutal death of Tyree Nichols while in police custody underscores that policing problems and racial violence remain crucial issues. We will continue to monitor these, as well as support progress for policing in Portland. Trish, please go ahead with your overview of the League of Women Voters 2021 study.
Thank you, Debbie. While the League of Women Voters of Portland, Oregon has been involved with policing since the 1980s, its members became increasingly concerned about continued shootings and violence by police against unarmed civilians, the apparent inability to fire police officers for misconduct, and the reinstatement of those who were fired. Several incidents of police injuring and arresting peaceful protesters and impinging upon fundamental rights of individuals had created an environment where public trust in law enforcement was seriously eroded. For these reasons, in May 2020, the League approved the preparation of a study regarding police discipline and accountability with a view towards articulating an official League advocacy position on the subject. The detailed 68-page report published in April 2021 was written and compiled by 22 League of Women Voters of Portland volunteers after 9 months of study, examination of numerous documents, and conducting 22 interviews with stakeholders ranging from police leadership to city council members, state legislators to police accountability advocates. The League's engagement in civilian oversight continues with its members regularly attending monthly the Citizen Review Committee, the Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing, and other police-related meetings. The 2021 report acknowledged the complexity of policing and that police officers work in demanding and sometimes dangerous jobs. Opinions about police accountability varied, but people on all sides of the issues believed that change was needed. Our study recommended action in the following areas. 1, ensuring accountability for police officers who violate community standards and Portland Police Department policies and directives, including requiring that officer misconduct be made via an independent entity and in a timely manner. 2, improving police culture to treat community members respectfully, including an official duty to intervene and report officer misconduct. 3, addressing bias-based policing. 4, reducing the use of force. 5, strengthening citizen oversight and community involvement and ensuring that genuine weight is given to community input. 6, enhancing transparency, record keeping, and documentation. And lastly, 7, investing in alternatives to armed officers. The link to our police oversight and accountability study is on our website, and we can add it to our Zoom chat. I'll do that in case someone else doesn't. But now it's time for James Offsink to moderate the program and introduce our panelists. Thanks, James.
Thank you so much, Trish and Debbie. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. As Debbie and Trish mentioned, my name is James Offsink, and aside from being an activist and advocate for criminal justice reform, and specifically on police accountability, I also have the honor of leading the League's Justice Interest Group, which helped put together tonight's program. Before we pass things over to the panel, I wanted to thank this tireless group of volunteers who make up the interest group and who have tracked these issues for many years now. And specifically, I wanted to call attention to our founding member and guiding light, Barbara Ross. We lost Barbara in 2022, and this group and tonight's event would not have been possible without Barbara's unfailing charm and penchant for arm twisting. And I wanted to make sure that I took a moment to honor her memory and everything she dedicated to this issue over a lifetime of service. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists who will help us understand the progress and challenges for Portland Police and policing alternatives. First, I am just beyond honored to share the stage here with a personal inspiration, the Reverend Dr. Leroy Haynes Jr. Dr. Haynes is chairperson of the Albina Ministerial Alliance Coalition for Justice and Police Reform. Dr. Haynes will make the opening comments and discuss police accountability and oversight and what has changed over the last many years in Portland. Next, Juan Chavez is the project director and attorney for the Oregon Justice Resource Center. He will update us on developments and challenges regarding the Department of Justice's settlement agreement with the Portland Police Bureau. Then Dr. Gina Ronning is a member of the Portland Police Bureau's Training Advisory Council, the TAC, as well as the Focused Intervention Team Community Oversight Group, known as FITCOG. Dr. Ronning will provide an update on both TAC and FITCOG with an emphasis on the Training Advisory Committee's program successes and challenges. And finally, before we move into question and answer, Kaya Sand is the executive director and columnist of Street Roots newspaper and will update us on the progress and concerns regarding the last several year implementation of the Portland Street Response. So I'm thrilled now to pass the microphone off to you, Reverend Dr. Haynes. Can you start us off with your thoughts on, or your summary of the Ministerial Alliance Coalition on Justice and Police Accountability's recent history on this issue?
Thank you so very much, and I give honor to the League of Women Voters that have been on this case for quite a while and for this program today. The Albina Ministerial Alliance Coalition for Justice and Police Reform is over 75 years old in the city of Portland. The AMA was started some 75 years ago. In 2003, with the death of Kendra James at the hand of a Portland police officer, we found a need to develop a broader coalition that was called the AMA Coalition for Justice and Police Reform, that was made up of 25 different community organizations as well as community activists. And so that was our beginning. So we've been focusing on this issue for quite a while, and with an intensity since 2003. But in the last 2 decades, we have experienced in the city of Portland limited progress in the transformation of the Portland Police Bureau. We have often moved 2 steps forward and 5 steps backwards. Prior to the Department of Justice lawsuit against the city of Portland and Portland Police Bureau, there was always a superficial change made to put the water on the fire of mass protests and the national shame that had come upon the city from the national media. It was not until we pushed the AMA coalition with other officials, the U.S. Department of Justice, to intervene after doing an assessment on the city of Portland and the Portland Police Bureau, found that the Portland Police Bureau had consistently violated the use of force and deadly force against the mentally ill, as well as those that were perceived to be mentally ill. This led to a settlement agreement in 2012 and 2013 that we developed here, and that the city agreed to make the necessary changes and transformation within the Portland Police. And what we found, even with this agreement, that any real attempt to have any systematic substantive change began to at least begin to happen in small increments. But even then, there was always a half-hearted police and practice implementation. It reminded me a lot of the Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas in 1954, when the Supreme Court decision said integration with all deliberate speed, that became all delayed speed. And that is very similar to what happened with the lawsuit. Now, there have been some substantive changes in the area of training. Some progress has been made. The escalation training has been implemented, but not always implemented by police officers on the streets of Portland. In fact, we find that often the police officers just do the opposite of the de-escalation training. Police have changed in the policies in written form, and we've changed quite a few policies, but not implementing those policies on the streets of Portland. And officers are not held accountable for violation. Community engagement has made some improvement, especially with PSEP, but still lack consistency on a regular, consistent basis. The technological monitoring of police officers' use of force has finally been set up, but the question of the implementation of it is still out there in left field. Street Roots response has made a more successful implementation process as alternative to 20th century policing moving to 21st century policing. But the greatest challenge that the AMA Coalition finds to the Portland Police Bureau is the lack of accountability. the transformation of Portland police culture. And there can be an accountability on the high rank level, but on the lower rank level of the sergeants, which are key in holding officers accountable for implementation of policies and practices. We feel that there's a failure that has taken place, and that affects the whole command system. The success of the passage of the independent oversight review board by 82% of the population of voting citizens, we feel will be a key element to help bring about accountability. But there's no systematic plan by the Portland Police Bureau to transform the culture of the Portland Police Bureau, just like what we have found in the recent Memphis, Tennessee thing. There's still a great culture of us against them, and those against them are always in terms the community of color and the mentally ill. And so that there's no particular plan for transformation. We feel that a court monitoring system where that reports directly to the judge, the federal judge, Michael, will be helpful in this process of implementation. But those are some of the, after 2 decades, there are so many things that we can lift up, but I think that will initiate a dialogue very clearly.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Reverend Doctor. And I know it's quite the task to take 75 years of AMAC history and just focus on 2 decades, but thank you for giving everybody that background.
Yes.
And now I'm going to turn it over to Juan to talk to us a little bit about the settlement agreement, which did feature heavily in Reverend Dr. Haynes' summary. So floor is yours.
Certainly. So Dr. Haynes did talk briefly about the settlement agreement that both the AMAC is a party to as an amicus, and also the group that I represent, the Mental Health Alliance, which represents folks who are personally affected with mental illness, providing services to them, and or persons who have lived experience with mental illness are also members of our alliance. And generally, our main field of expertise is talking about that very lived experience and what actually happens when they come into contact with police officers. And I think, if there's a central thesis for MHA, it's that policing as a policy choice is caustic, is dangerous for people with mental illness. And so limiting the amount of contact that a person with mental illness has with police officers is the safest way to address their ways to protect them from police violence. And, that is ultimately the finding of the Department of Justice, that the Portland Police Bureau does have this pattern and practice of using too much force too often, and often with deadly consequences against people experiencing a mental health crisis or exhibiting symptoms of mental illness. And so the history of the the grand saga that is the settlement agreement, the MHA has been involved since 2018, the AMAC since its inception. Really, I don't think anybody who has watched this case thought it would take this long. We are about 11 years since the finding letter that the Department of Justice showed that they believe there was this pattern in practice, and they filed this case under federal statutes that allows the Department of Justice to sue police departments that have pattern and practices of violating the Constitution. Here, the Fourth Amendment. And the settlement agreement has been signed, sealed, and delivered since 2014. And since then, we've been in this, to go into the legal aspects of this for a second, in this pattern of going to the court to discuss one central question: is this settlement agreement fair, adequate, and reasonable? So every time that we go to court on this, what the judge wants to hear is the city of Portland substantially compliant with the settlement agreement, and are those components of the settlement agreement fair, adequate, and reasonable? That is, as we have seen over the years, kind of a shifting proposition, because generally speaking, when you already agree that something in the settlement agreement is fair, adequate, and reasonable, that's it. And yet, portions of the settlement agreement, like the PSEP amendment, had been held in provisional acceptance for several years. It was recently accepted. And following that, the city was found in substantial compliance with the entirety of the settlement agreement. That was in, I want to say 2020, January 2020, very different time than the present, obviously. But the significance of that was, after 6 years of being under the settlement agreement, where the city had to follow the Department of Justice's strictures, the city had to maintain substantial compliance for 1 year. Now, what happened in 2020? Of course, Mr. Floyd was murdered, and the Department of Justice saw what the Portland police then did in 2020 and realized, I think the underlying presumptions that we had when forming this settlement agreement might have been flawed, might have been premature to say the department had, in fact, substantially complied with it, and additional requirements were then added into the settlement agreement. Presently, I think the big fight, as Dr. Haynes has talked about, is what to do going forward. So just a broad outline of what it is that is the settlement agreement. In large part, I think it reflected what was the early 2010s' understanding of what policing needed to do to become compliant with the Constitution and, more practically serve the public's interest in providing safety and also their own well-being. And at that time, I think the belief was, if we could train police departments, if we can fund them enough to have both the training and supervision and oversight that the Department of Justice believed was necessary, we could get out from under, centuries of I'd say a political policy choice to do policing the way that we do, which is generally send police officers into areas that I'll say the white supremacist overbearing culture of the American Republic believed to be the problems. So the presumption that training and oversight and other methods of tracking both of those things would solve these problems came apart over the course of the next decade, both in 2020 and I think what we just saw in Memphis. Memphis, the Memphis Police Department, just as the country all saw, just brutally murdered Tyre Nichols. And Memphis itself is an example of a lot of the checklist items that are present in settlement agreements like our own: increased training, increased diversity and inclusion, body cameras. All of those points were present in Memphis. And I'd say that it's a positive that the public is able to see what it is that these Memphis police officers did, but fundamentally it didn't stop what happened to Mr. Nichols. And that, I think, is in the back of all of our minds when we're talking about what's going to happen next in this settlement agreement. Because presently, what's in this new provisions that come out of the 2020 uprising in defense of Black lives are in primary part auditing the actions of the Portland Police Bureau in 2020, as well as instituting a body-worn camera policy and rollout regime, and also introducing a means for the Department of Justice to watch and hopefully enforce what the voters approved in 2020 for there to be a independent civilian-run police oversight and discipline board that is currently being negotiated, developed by the Portland, oh gosh, I'm gonna forget all the initials here. The PAC,
the Police Accountability Commission.
That is it. Perfect. So that's largely what's in Section 11. And as Dr. Haynes has talked about, there's an additional layer here of is the settlement agreement's governance going to move to a special master model? The city of Portland in this particular settlement agreement is unique in the country, and I want to be mindful of my time, so please cut me off as soon as you need. This particular city Department of Justice accountability model is unique in this country, and I do mean unique. We're the only ones that have been doing it this way, where the Department of Justice both serves as monitoring and enforcement for the settlement agreement. Other cities have what is called a special master, basically an extension of the federal judge, who can referee a lot of the compliance components of the settlement agreement. In other cities, they have pretty vast powers of subpoenaing documents, in inspecting and reviewing police trainings, that kind of stuff. And then if there's a compliance issue, the Department of Justice can then step in and enforce compliance. And that's currently being debated and mediated in the city of Portland. There are some pieces of this that I frankly can't talk about, since there are ongoing mediations on what the scope of that monitor would be, maybe additional components of that. But we are going to be going before Judge Simon, who has been keeping this case going for the last 10 years, 11 years. and we're going to be doing that on February 28th. The public is certainly can participate, and I would encourage people to participate and watch how this process works. On the 28th, particularly, and there's a lot of lore in this case, and tracking it all, I understand, is very difficult, so I apologize for speed running this. But on the 28th, we're talking about some of the components from Section 11, the additional components from 2020, where the city was supposed to analyze problematic things that came out of 2020, including that training slide deck, where Portland Police had been training their officers to believe that anybody seeking police accountability were dirty hippies who could be beaten up at a whim. Only marginal editorializing there too. That's pretty latent in the training that they gave. The judge was hoping to hear an update on that. Judge was hoping to hear an update on the city's bargaining over body-worn cameras. The city was supposed to have answers on that over the last 2 other hearings that we had in the last 6 months. And there has been mum from them on those topics. So we'll see what they have to present to the judge. The increasingly impatient judge who is signaling to the city that he's willing to take further action if there's nothing to, if they're not bringing anything to the table come February 28th.
Thank you so much, Juan. As far as that last part for, at the league, we very strongly want to get community members engaged. And you said the hearing on the 28th is a good place for people to come and to learn. How would people attend that?
Sure. So it'll be happening in Judge Simon's chambers in the federal courthouse. You can pick which one that is out based on the heavy fencing and boards that are up around it. But if you were to show up, it is, I want to say, on the 15th floor. And the main requirement is you have a photo identification and you're willing to be it's basically airport rules. Take off your shoes, that kind of stuff. And there would be a gallery that you come and sit, and even you can sign up to testify if you'd like to talk about the city's compliance with the settlement agreement and your thoughts on that. Judge Simon, I want to make this pitch to the public. Greatly appreciative, and will indeed roll out the red carpet for public comment on this case. And this is one of the rare federal lawsuits where there is such thing as public comment. He loves it, and he takes that into due consideration. Often has flipped the entire schedule of the court hearing to accommodate public comment. So please do show up. There's sometimes even overflow rooms as well, where you can watch from a different room and then show up for your testimony if you'd like. Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to turn the floor over to Dr. Ronning. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to your insights on the Training Advisory Commission and the FitCog program's successes and concerns.
Great, thank you so much. And my goal is to sort of go over effectiveness, successes, and challenges for each. Both the Focus Intervention team as well as the Training Advisory Council are advisory in nature. So this means that our effectiveness is highly dependent on the relationships that we have with PPB, specifically between the FitCog and the FIT team, as well as between TAC and the PPB training division. Our mode of working is through influence rather than power. So both FitCog and TAC have been successful in getting seats at the table where it counts, including confidential briefings for FitCog specifically, trainings, observations, and participation in interview processes. As far as the Training Advisory Council, regarding our effectiveness, the TAC has had a positive and strong working relationship with the PPB training division, which contributes to our ability to be successful. TAC has been given, our feedback has been incorporated into police trainings as seen by comparing first and second runs. The Training Advisory Council could be more effective, however, in how our task groups are structured. Some are successful and others are less so. In 2022, there were a total of 5 active task groups, and those included officer wellness, officer community relationship perceptions, quality improvement implementation, restorative justice, and the advanced academy. And we are currently figuring out what task groups will be operational for 2023. TAC has been successful in doing much with its has not been that successful in doing much with its quarterly use of force reports. And our steering committee is exploring the idea of perhaps forming a specialized task group dedicated to managing those reports. Specific successes with the TAC, we continue to have a very strong working relationship with the training division. We have found the training division to actually be very welcoming, open to our visits, transparent. They've been very giving of appreciation and thankful for community participation and input. We've had a long-term success in making recommendations that have been implemented by the training division and the Portland Police Chief. Very few of our recommendations have been rejected, and this speaks to our good record of success. However, we do believe that a title or subject matter evaluation to track what is specifically being approved is needed and should be ongoing. TAC is also gaining more access for impactful things like training to materials for review. This is a pretty big advancement in the relationship between TAC and PPB. TAC has been invited to observe both dry run and live trainings. Live training observation is relatively new and demonstrates a big leap of faith on the part of the training division. Some of the challenges in the TAC, leadership turnover is really rapid within the Bureau. We get good captains in the training division, but then there's always this risk that when turnover is high, we have to start over from scratch and we have to rebuild those relationships, and that can be really challenging. So far, it hasn't really been an issue, but it's always a risk when you're experiencing that turnover. It is said that the new civilian training dean might mitigate some of those concerns, so we're looking forward to that. Some other challenges, the PPB training division is short-staffed and does not have the structural support to run ongoing training or continuing education post-initial trainings. So often the training division struggles to implement the required trainings and therefore tends to not prioritize soft skill training when forced to choose between hard skills and soft skills. And obviously, when we're talking about things like de-escalation, emotional regulation, things that involve emotional intelligence skills, generally speaking, the PPB still views those as soft, and those still don't make it, with the limitations that they have, these types of trainings are still not really considered priority. It isn't always easy to measure the actual impact of TAC recommendations. This is going to require some heavy lifting, research mostly on both sides, the civilian side and the PPB side. The community as a whole, but specifically the TAC, would benefit on getting statistics on effectiveness over the long term regarding any recommendations that we have made or implemented. As you know, managing personalities and intergroup dynamics is always also challenging. So sometimes the TAC is fairly large group. So our membership, I think our most recent membership is 20, but we've been as large as 30, I believe, at certain times. And so it can be challenging just managing that. We're also in the process of re-examining and sort of reimagining what accessibility looks like in an advisory space. And so that has to do with, looking at our recruitment processes. There was a resurgence of interest in people participating in advisory groups in 2020, but we don't know how sustainable that interest is going to be. We also are looking at what it means to engage the wider community. Historically, the TAC is predominantly made up of sort of older, white, cisgendered males belonging to a particular social class who are usually formally educated. And so it's limiting. Also, the process to even get into the TAC can feel very intimidating and challenging. And so we're having a conversation right now in the steering committee to figure out what are ways that we can make these spaces more accessible and inclusive. PPB has had some recent feedback for the TAC. They've been happy about the increased level of engagement from community. They feel that that the recommendations that are being produced out of the TAC are they're more specific and more detailed than historically, and they're more informed due to the levels of individualized understanding of the people joining the group. So that was some of our most recent feedback. And for FitCog, the Focus Intervention Community Oversight Group. This is a fairly newer advisory group, and it emerged as a response and a need to advising and overseeing the work of the FIT, which is the Focus Intervention Team of the PPB, which is a specialized team of officers that are sent out to interrupt directly gun violence on the streets of Portland. We are a fairly new group, but we have had successes. So regarding our effectiveness, the FitCog, also like the TAC, has had a positive and strong working relationship with the PPB FIT team, which contributes to our effectiveness. We measure our effectiveness through both informal and formal recommendations. Informal recommendations are the day-to-day insights FitCog members give the FIT during public and confidential sessions regarding recruitment, intervention strategies, data tracking, mission, and community concerns. Formal recommendations are recommendations made that we create that we send directly to the mayor's office. Unlike the TAC, which sends its recommendations to the chief of police, we send ours directly to the mayor. We've been very effective in having our input included in recruitment letters, hiring standards, and interviews. In the spring of 2022, we sent in our first formal recommendation to the City of Portland Mayor's Office regarding the use of gunfire detection technology to assist the FIT. The city has now taken that recommendation and has opened up a bidding process for a potential pilot project. The City of Portland has also been accepting public input on the use of such technologies and continues public discourse on the matter. Specifically, the public discourse piece was a specific recommendation of the FITCOG. We've been very effective at building a diplomatic and professional relationship with the FIT, and as a result, we have regular and are given direct access to FIT leaders and officers on the ground. We are able to speak with them directly, attend roll calls, participate in ride-alongs, and do direct observation in the field. Successes. We have been highly successful in helping to stand up the FIT team itself and implement a stronger set of hiring practices. We've been successful in drafting from scratch our entire group charter, bylaws, and community agreements. We have created a strong consensus-based decision-making model, which forces all proposals to address concerns, amendments in a manner that produces more inclusive and holistic outcomes. And we continually to build positive working relationships with the PPB to build a stronger foundation for hard conversations. Our most recent conversation centered on policing culture and a critical exploration into the police violence carried out by the Memphis Police Department against Tyree Nichols. We have finally obtained a robust membership, which is contributing greatly to depth of our discussions and diversity of thought. And challenges. We've had a few. For one, just like the TAC, PPB leadership turnover, our initial sergeants and lieutenants for the TAC have shifted. So we've had to sort of start over with building some of those relationships, but it's been going okay so far. We've had to spend a lot of time on foundational group work before we were able to engage in any advisory work. So unlike the TAC, which has been established for numerous years, the FITCOG is brand new, and we are part of sort of the foundational crew that is standing up this group. And so we are literally creating it from scratch, and that's taken a lot of time, but we feel very good about the work that we've done so far. Other challenges, we've had a delay in getting diverse member participation to the COG due to city politics. We had a delay in getting officers to initially respond to the recruitment call out for the FIT due to concerns over lack of support broadly defined. And there has been a general lack of public support and controversy surrounding the existence of the FIT due to the conceptual divide over policing and previous strategies regarding the interruption of gun violence on the streets of Portland. There's been some public confusion regarding our role as the COG, regarding what powers we have or do not have. And another challenge is that Portland has a very specific process for police accountability, and this process is completely siloed from advisory groups, and we are not permitted to know or have access to any investigative information involving officer-involved shootings. We have had a couple of officer-involved shootings involving the FIT. We have not been able to get access to the types of information that we would like to have around that. One case is actively still under investigation. And so we're really limited in our advisory role regarding what we can do with that information, if we could even access it to begin with. The other challenge is that PPB has external limitations, which makes it very difficult for them to become a learning institution. Specifically, the role of the city attorney's office greatly controls the narratives and limits the ability of the PPB to become a more reflective, vulnerable, and engaging truth-telling agency. And it's really important for the public to understand the structures that actually prevent PPB from engaging in some of the behaviors that we would like them to engage in when it comes to things like public acknowledgement and the history around violent policing. And where we are going. We are currently in the middle of identifying our main focus areas for the coming year in the FITCOG. These areas have been shaped by our experiences that members have had by attending recent ride-alongs and roll calls, and some of the emerging data that's coming out in our confidential sessions. Potential areas of focus for this year, although not officially decided, but things that we're certainly looking at, are reviewing fit training materials, specifically making training recommendations for the fit, looking into other mechanisms and tools which can potentially reduce negative outcomes for interruption on the streets, and proposing a potential community integrative framework for gun violence interruption, which includes community-based policing strategies for the fit. And that is my update right on the dot, 7:45.
That was very punctual. Thank you very much, Dr. Ronning, for that overview. And I'm sure we'll return to many of the things that you shared during the Q&A. So thank you for giving everybody background on those two community oversight groups. Now I'm going to pass it over to our final panelist, Kaya Sand. And while Kaya is speaking, you will be enwrapped in the content of her comments, but I hope you're also thinking in the audience, if you have questions that have come up for you, please be formulating those as well, and please message them. I think it has to go to the host and panelists or whatever, but whatever chat option you have there to send them in. And Audrey will be, from the league, will be curating those. And after Kaya's presentation or opening remarks, we'll then begin asking those questions of the panelists. And now, Kaya, I'm going to turn the floor over to you to talk to us a little bit about Portland Street Response.
Thank you, James. I'm really honored to be on this panel and grateful to the League of Women Voters for hosting this. So as the final panelist, my area that I'm going to address is actually about standing up a new first responder system that removes police from an area in which police historically have responded, and that's Portland Street Response. I direct street routes, so I am not an employee of Portland Street Response. I don't work for the city. So my knowledge is coming from the outside, and it's coming really more from an advocacy vantage point. I consider this a probably lifelong area of advocacy, because I know that I have to just keep my my teeth in it, so to speak. And I am inspired, especially by Reverend Dr. Leroy Haynes, in terms of realizing that we're in the long game. So I thought what I would just do is briefly describe where Portland Street Response is today, a little bit of the arc of getting there. In particular, my reasoning is to establish the values that are behind it, because I think that's so important with the advocacy and the kind of tenacity that it requires to really see it through. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges that I see for us right ahead. And I'll just say up front, because this has been a program that's been stood up through the work particularly of an elected official, Commissioner Joanne Hardesty, being so instrumental in this. I think one of our challenges now is to make sure this becomes very much deep-seated in our city as elected officials transition. So I'm actually going to share websites as I talk, because I thought it might be helpful to show resources, so that if there's things you actually want to look at later, you're able to do that. So actually, this is just the city website for Portland Street Response. But one of the things I thought would be helpful for starting it is just showing what Portland Street Response does and doesn't respond to, because that actually then highlights some of the challenges we have ahead. So Portland Street Response, the idea was really germinated on May 15th, 2018 was when Street Roots issued our report for Portland Street Response. The campaign was subsequent to that. And the pilot began in the spring of 2021. So there was a little bit of a delay between the funding and actually when it began. And then in 2022, it expanded citywide. The pilot in 2021 started in Lentz. It expanded to be citywide. But even when I say citywide, that doesn't mean it's at full capacity. It's running from, I believe it's 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. So just to give a sense, of course, many crises happen outside those hours. So it's still, I would view it still as in a pilot kind of stage. And that part of the pressure that we all have a responsibility for is to have it continue to grow. But just briefly, the kinds of things that Portland Street responds to are mostly outside. And so these are crises, often mental health crises, or, the kinds of crises where someone does not actually know. Is it sleep deprivation? Is it substance use? Is it mental health? Is it just that every single, the Social Security and everyone else is hung up on you that day, right? Like there's a lot of things that can be behind how someone might be acting. But most of it is outside. People can, Portland Street Response can be dispatched when it's someone in a publicly accessible lobby. But this is a shortcoming. A program like Cahoots in Eugene can actually go inside a residence. And I think, when we do sort of our thought experiments of some of the things that have gone horribly wrong in Portland, they have happened inside residences too, at times when Portland Street Response could have been the responder. And also they are not dispatched for people in traffic. Again, that's something we know, that people do wander into the street a fair amount when they're in crisis, and that they cannot be suicidal. So just pointing that out, that these are some of the areas that we have to continue to work on with Portland Street Response. Portland Street Response dispatches a medic. They dispatch a community health worker, a kind of crisis worker, peer support workers, and is housed under Portland Fire and Rescue. They have several community health programs. And so it's Portland Street Response with this chat program for people who are frequent 911 callers. And I often think that the framing of that is that their crisis is often homelessness. And it's also for other things like vaccine dispatches and things like that. So you can kind of see the logic of having it under fire, at least for now. And the other really important logic is that it is wired so strongly into the 911 dispatch system. So, just really briefly in terms of how it did start, Commissioner Hardesty actually campaigned on this idea when she ran last time. And at Street Roots, what we really seized upon this idea. Here's an issue that we ran on March 15th, 2019, and we really laid out a plan. We did a whole issue just devoted to how do we rethink what we're doing in Portland, because also we had the good fortune of having Cahoots to the south of us. So we had a lot that we could, piggyback on already. And with that, what I would say is that the impetus, there's been people trying to get this going for so long. We had this kind of convergence at that moment of Commissioner Hardesty being in office, and of the Oregonian starting to reveal what it and Reveal magazine have repeatedly revealed, and that is that over half of all arrests in Portland are unhoused people. Since 2017, over half of all the arrests in Portland are of unhoused people. It's tremendous. And it's a tremendous expensive use of resources too. And it causes major trauma, and it causes legal entanglements. And that is part of my passion working with unhoused people, is that I see people who have legal entanglements that bar them from getting housing and employment. And so it's quite frankly, absurd system to be dispatching police who do warrant checks, who then put them back into that system. We also knew at that time, the Willamette Week revealed that 911 was every 15 minutes was receiving a so-called unwanted person call every 15 minutes. And so these were usually trespass, welfare check, those kinds of calls. So it's just this kind of abundance of the systems. And, we started a campaign after we we ran that issue and really kind of rapidly scaled up. And I just thought I'd pull up, these are some signs that people on the streets actually made during that time. Mental illness is not a crime, doctors not cops, real emergencies are dismissed. This is someone really writing out their thoughts. EMTs show up, please, hospitals for all, because that is another thing, right? Is people are frequently arrested who are unhoused in ERs, and that is often because people are so agitated being thrown back out onto the streets. So that's another kind of entanglement with this whole system. So please send someone without a gun is something that we frequently would hear. And so I think, you know, during the summer of 2019, when we were working to scale or to actually develop this idea for the program, we worked with Commissioner Hardesty and a number of other groups to do a report called Believe Our Stories and Listen. And Street Roots vendors went out, other unhoused people went out, we worked with PSU and did survey after survey after survey just to hear from people on the streets. What did they actually need? And that sign about please send someone without a gun was just so vivid. We heard that again and again. There's a man who was a Street Roots vendor who died this last fall, and I will always do this work in his memory. He told me early on he was often in mental health distress on the streets. He was a Black man, and I honestly feared for his life frequently as he was wandering around. And he did not die, fortunately, at the hands of another, but he would say that when his brain itched, is how he described it, when his brain itched, he needed a soothing voice, not a badge and a gun. And that's what we hear again and again and again. So one of the biggest findings when we did that survey is, you know, that complete need to have any of this response to be separate from the police. And this is something we were trying to build against because the prior kind of crisis response that the county still has, the Project Respond, our papers showed that over 70% of their calls were co-responded with police. So we've been really fighting against that kind of co-response model that so many cities end up creeping toward, that starts to break down the trust immediately. And then there are a number of other recommendations that we heard from people through that survey that eventually informed how Portland Street Response was formed. Now, Portland Street Response gets a evaluation every 6 months, and that's through Portland State. I will say that Street Roots also works on that. Our vendors are employed, so people experiencing homelessness and poverty that sell the paper are employed to go out and survey other unhoused people to get some of the data and qualitative information for this survey. But it's been every 6 months, and actually today I should have snapped a picture because they were out with their clipboards. So they're on their 2-year evaluation today. And one of the things that I thought was really helpful just to see, and if anyone wants to read any of these reports, they're really useful, I think, for us all to be tracking this information, is with the outcome goals. One of the outcomes already, and as I said, it's not scaled up to the extent where it needs to be, but already they're seeing an 18% or 18.7% reduction in police response on non-emergency welfare checks and unwanted person calls. So remember, I was saying that was one of those key data points early on with Willamette Week. This is where it was just going out, completely out of control, and it still is. So that is one of, I think, the key kinds of data points that they've shown. It's also another thing that I think is really helpful to realize is that sometimes people are in crisis because they have medical distress. I think of a time when I was I'm going to wrap up really quickly, that when I was in Eugene viewing Cahoots, and the person was having what looked like a mental health crisis, he actually had an untreated wound and was stressed out because he was late for a cancer appointment. So they treated the wound on the sidewalk and they drove him to the appointment. medical needs are often kind of underlying these things. People's feet are a mess, right? Like there's just so much going on. So the fact that Portland Street Response has also been able to treat calls on the spot and only 1.9% have been transported to the hospital is another kind of success, because it's like the low acuity kinds of calls can actually be treated. So I'm going to stop the share there. And then what I wanted to just bring up as we really think about like what are our challenges ahead, one of the things that I mentioned in the beginning is to make sure that this is carried forward, that it is not about, people staking claim in the sense of if other elected officials lose interest in it. It's incumbent upon the whole public to demand that this is a Portland potential success story. And I also just want to emphasize there are three prongs for me in terms of how I measure how Portland Street Response is doing. It has to be big enough to be successful. It's not yet. It has to be nimble enough to be successful. Those areas that I was pointing out early, in terms of like not being able to go inside, not to be able to go in traffic, those are impediments upon that nimbleness. And any impediments such as that actually then cause people to lose confidence also in it. And it causes the program to not be able to meet the needs of someone in crisis, right? Sometimes they just need a transport to their doctor. And we've got to have a program that's able to do that so something doesn't get worse and they don't get arrested or worse with an encounter with the police. So big enough, nimble enough. And the last thing goes back to our topic today, completely separate from the police. And I'm always tracking that. The co-response, I see cities across the country that they start to go in this direction, then they talk about co-response. It's just, that's what breaks the program down. That's what breaks the trust down. So I'll just leave on the fact that I am such a believer in budgets, and that is where we can advocate. That's where we can get in front of city council. I'm going to be writing columns all spring about this, and I'm doing a sit along with 911 in a couple of weeks to start to really track that, because I want to really have an understanding of exactly what we should be advocating for to make sure that this council, because there are a number of folks who are new or maybe not as invested, if they are not as invested, that we make sure that they know they have to be.
Well, thank you so much, Kaya. And wow, I mean, when you talk about a success story, for Portland as well, seeing the Portland Street Response start to become, a value. And I think to your point, it is incumbent on all of us, to continue calling for that and demanding it. But it has seemed like in the first few years that it, it's very hard for elected officials to speak, badly of it, because the way that the public has continued to say, no, this is, the alternative to traditional responses that we want. For folks who are not frequently picking up street routes, I very much encourage you to do so. Kaya and her team have done some of the best reporting on this issue and many other issues that our city has. Before we turn it over to the audience Q&A, we like to recognize that we have such a wealth of perspectives and history on this issue here on the panel. And I just wonder if there's anything that came up for panelists as you were listening to the other panelists, if you wanted to ask, a direct question or follow up, or if, something bubbled up for you that you wanted to share in response. Just wanted to give a moment for that before we hand it over to the audience questions.
Well, I would just love to ask Reverend Dr. Haynes if you have any advice in terms of the tenacity when things are just so dang hard.
Well, Dr. T. Allen Belter used to often say this thing is not a sprint, but a marathon. I've been in the civil rights movement, and March with King was a snake field organizer and a co-organizer of the Black Panther Party in the state of Texas. So I've been at this thing a while, and you have to keep chipping away at it. Sometimes there are setbacks, but it's worth it in dealing with human life. I think one of the things we have to be aware of is that often, as I talk to regular police officers, they are quick to say that what happened in Memphis couldn't happen here, or what happened in with George Floyd couldn't happen here. But I correct them quickly. That has already happened. James Chassie was beaten to death here. Okay. Aaron Campbell was shot in the back here. You know, Black women have been killed here in the city of Portland. So it's not that it just didn't get national attention at that time. But I do believe that we have to be persistent and consistent, because we've gone through so many mayors and so many city council, and the interest dropped. And that's why it's so critical to have the federal Judge Michael and a court monitor to push the city on the legal emphasis. One of the strategies when I was in the civil rights movement with Dr. King is that we would operate on several levels. We would use legal leverages, we would use marches, and we would use economic leverage in order to kind of push the agenda item. And I think if you don't do that, it would reach a point where it's forgotten. Take, for example, during the late 80s, we developed a plan for gang intervention. When we brought the numbers of gang intervention down during the late 80s, the city took the money and redistributed it somewhere. And then the numbers pop up again. And those programs that were very effectively in gang intervention began to fade away. You know, there was always a restarting of the process because they wanted to use it for the budget. And so you're certainly right, especially with the new city council people, and all of them are not passionate towards reform of the Portland Police. The citizens have to keep the pressure on and the leverage. And I do believe that we can create, one of my goals as a model for the nation. Instead of being on the opposite end, we can create a model for the nation on community policing, not 19th century policing, 18th century, but 21st century policing. And the street response is one of those aspects of that model to create 21st century policing where trust can be built. You cannot have public safety and not have accountability and reform. The two go together if we're going to have a beautiful city in Portland and a prosperous city and an inclusive city for everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Haynes. Is there anything else before we pass it off to Audrey? Okay, Audrey, what questions are our audience members wondering about, having heard from our initial opening from our panelists?
Thank you, James. It did occur to me as we were partway through our discussions here at this panel that a list of acronyms might be helpful for those of us. Whenever we enter into this, there is quite an alphabet soup to sort through. So hopefully that will be helpful. If you haven't seen the League of Women Voters of Portland's study report about our police accountability oversight study that we released in 2021, it does have a lot of background about some of these groups, lists and acronym guide, and we can probably drop the link to that in the chat if you haven't had a chance to read that, or it's been 2 years, you want to refresh your reading of that classic report. We have a lot of great questions coming in. One, to just get us started, a question for all of the panelists. If you could make one change or recommendation to Portland policing, what would that be?
Well, that's the kind of question that I feel like no one is going to want to be the first person on. So, Juan,
it's
I
you,
think you
James.
drew the short stick. Let's go, Juan, Dr. Ronning, Kaya, and then Reverend Dr. Haynes.
Okay.
I think greatly limit its scope, budget, and role. Because, speaking to what I think I've heard from everybody, we can have the cutting edge training that we want. We can have the kind of implicit bias understanding of policing, but if the role of policing is still to go into particular neighborhoods to attack certain kinds of people, to address certain kinds of low-level crime that is important for property owners, I think we're still going to have the same results that we've seen for the last century and a half. Policing is a policy choice. And I think what we've seen with street response is that there is, in fact, an alternative. And, our group, Mental Health Alliance, has been studying some of the data of use of force. And I think there is, in fact, a decrease in some kinds of uses of force. And I think that is largely attributable to PSR, to Portland Street Response, being deployed to some calls that police officers used to be called to. Now, why it is that we think that is because severity of force when police are deployed to certain calls has increased. When police are called, force has increased, the severity of the force has increased. And I think that just points to what I think is our central thesis, that police contact drives police force. And so getting rid of opportunities for police to come into contact with human beings, I think, is my policy choice.
My first priority would be like the real estate people that say, what is your main thing about purchasing and developing something? And they say location, location, location. I would say for reforming the Portland police or any police, accountability, accountability, accountability. Dr. Martin Luther King, when I marched with him and organized with him, would often say, I may not be able to change your heart the way you hate me, but I can change you killing me by changing the laws that would hold you accountable for killing me. And so I say accountability, accountability, accountability. When we start holding officers for breaking the policies, the practices, the Constitution, and the use of deadly force or unnecessary force accountable, you will see a radical transformation in police.
I bring a slightly different lens. My background is in restorative justice. I've worked in prisons for over 12 years, doing restorative work in there as well. So and then my work with police kind of gives me this interesting lens. From my perspective, there's a really big difference between responsibility and accountability. So for me, we need to hold police both responsible, which is the part where there are consequences for choices that are made that are violent and are not part of the community values that we would like to see in policing. But accountability is something else. Accountability is not something that we can impose upon somebody else or an institution. It's something that has to come from within. And so part of the issue from the work I've been doing is that the police department is structurally bound by other systems such as the city's attorney's office, I'm going to keep bringing that up, and other structures that actually prevent them from holding themselves accountable. There might be internal mechanisms that the police might implement culturally to help check negative behavior or bad outcomes within the organization. But in order to actually cultivate a culture of accountability, we have to remove the barriers in the system that prevent them from doing that. The Portland Police Bureau is not a learning institution. And what I mean by that is that when an officer makes a mistake, they're driven by fear, right? And so they're driven by fear of punitive responses from the system, and they're driven by fear within their own institutions, and they're driven in such a way that they don't engage in truth-telling. They do not have the freedom to admit that something is wrong and then to use those examples as case examples for training. So, for example, the city attorney's office actually prohibits the police department from specifically citing landmark cases, for example, James Chassie or maybe Kendra James, actually using those examples to actually launch training curriculum off of that. Like, so it's really important to understand like what accountability would actually look like in practice and cultivating that culture. The other piece that I would say that's really significant, and I disagree actually from Mr. Chavez's perception. I do believe in limiting the scope of policing and really prioritizing where we need policing, but radical defunding or removing structures within the police department also does not necessarily bring us the results that we would want either. And this gets back to this kind of the other question about hard skills or soft skills. When you limit police resources, at the end of the day, they will always choose hard skills. And what I mean by that are the tactical trainings, right? Like the physical part of their job. They will always choose that over the other skill sets until there's a culture change or until they are not in a place of scarcity where they can actually balance and invest resources in both. And so my experience has been that scarcity culture within the Bureau also creates problems. Then the other piece around training is that there's a difference between the Memphis Police Department that may have a list of check boxes, right? Like every department that says they want to do improvements could say, oh, we're doing diversity training, we're doing this, right? And they have their list and their little check boxes. We have to understand, though, that it's not the training that's continuing the problem. It's that it's performative, that the training actually isn't happening. So I'm going to give some pushback and say it's not that the training is happening and therefore it is ineffective and the culture is still happening. I'm going to argue that there actually isn't any fidelity or even oversight in how training is implemented. So in the Portland Police Bureau, when we have these trainings, they're one-offs, right? We're not cultivating a culture of change. We're initiating initial training at the beginning of the academy. An officer is going to be inundated with 12 weeks or more of intensive training from the state level to the city level. And are they going to remember the 8 hours of DEI training they got at the very beginning of their academy? No. Right. So my argument is that training culture within police bureaus is extremely problematic and is mostly performative. And so unless we radically change that and actually hold officers to the fidelity of the training, the quality of the training, and that trainings need to be ongoing, we will never see that culture shift. So I agree with Mr. Chavez in the sense that he's right. These things by themselves with those check boxes isn't going to radically change culture. But I'm also going to argue that the training and the things that are on those little check boxes are probably not really happening the way we would want to see them happen. Thank you.
I'm just going to scope out and go back to the budget. And I know it's a little bit, it's maybe a little hackneyed just to bring up the fact that values are in budgets. But when I brought up the fact that over half of all arrests every year are of unhoused people, and that number has been stubborn, and the numbers are very, very high too in terms of jail usage. So we're clearly not deploying police for the clear purpose of what they should be doing. And if you look at then the use of jails and the use of police for street crises that involve welfare checks or involve essentially people calling the police about people in distress. Those are, of course, upstream problems. So, I think it's just always really helpful to reimagine what we do and just to do a thought experiment of what would it look like if we took the kind of funding that we give one area that's about crime and we gave it to another area. So I know that's kind of broad strokes, but I think it's really important just to point that out, that the police are doing a lot of work that's not really about what they should be doing.
Thank you all for your answers and big thinking, big visioning here. That's what we need. We have a more specific question, perhaps for Mr. Chavez or Dr. Haynes, about the Anti-Terrorism Task Force, the Joint Terrorism Task Force. How is the effort to rejoin the Anti-Terrorism Task Force going to affect the settlement and any effort to change the culture of policing? Any of you who have thoughts on this, please feel free to speak up, but maybe we'll start again with Mr. Chavez.
Sure. I mean, I think it does speak to the interest of police that, I think what the common experience of Portlanders is, we have a lack of services, we have a lack of housing, we have a lack of opportunity. I think what policing solves, if anything, are the prerogatives of the status quo of law and order, of maintaining that, what is happening in the streets is actually an aberration and not just a policy choice that we've determined is acceptable, so long as we can keep property values where they are. And I think that the Joint Terrorism Task Force, I mean, we're now 22 years out from 9/11, and we're still convinced that there is value in assigning resources for the police bureau to interface with the FBI on, what we have now understood to be a large surveillance network of Muslim Americans, of Black Americans, anybody who wants to organize around issues that support either of those groups. And so I think it's not in and of itself perhaps nefarious, but again, it identifies where the interests are and where the funding goes and where the energy is put. This is not what Portlanders, I think, largely care about.
From my perspective, I approach it as a constitutional issue of the First Amendment. And I also approach it as what we haven't talked about is white supremacy and racial bias that takes place, that I don't care what kind of education you're in, unless the hearts of people change. You have to hold them responsible. We in the African-American community have been the victims of J. Edgar Hoover and the victims of COINTELPRO, going back to the civil rights movement with the investigations on Dr. King and civil rights leadership, the abuse of power by the FBI and other intelligence and government entities that have tried to stifle and destroy the civil rights movement. And of course, we understand there has to be intelligence, but when it is abused and corrupted, and there's a history of it, of these kind of abuse that will target progressive groups in a democratic society, we have to have restrictions on them. We will end up creating another Third Reich, another fascism government, when the police and other entities are not put in check.
Thank you, Dr. Haynes. We have a lot of questions from our wonderful audience. A lot of it is just expressing the collective sense of what's the answer? What do we need to do? How do we work to keep the public safe and avoid undesirable tragic events? I wonder if there's any other cities that you look to as examples to learn from, positive examples, or just how do you move forward? Where are you looking for answers about what do we need to do to move forward? We'll maybe turn to Ms. Sand, Dr. Haynes, you're starting.
Yeah, I think there's no panacea. When we brought the case to the Department of Justice on coming to the city of Portland, we never look upon the DOJ suit as a panacea to solve all the problems with the community. That it has to be a diversity of strategies and approaches to this problem. It was not created in just a short time. We're dealing with centuries of issues that have been developed and that have not been corrected over the years. And so I think when we look for just one thing, that will never be a full solution. But what we look at is best practices and strategies that have been effective. And even those best practices and strategies have to be indigenized to the city of Portland. We are unique in Portland. The Rose City is unique in itself. So we have to indigenize those to the city. But at the same time, just like in terms of the court monitor, we find that in New Orleans was one of the most effective cities using that court monitor and transforming their police department. Have they completed their process? No, but they have been effective in making a lot of changes and producing best practices. So I think we have to approach it as multiple solutions to an issue that is very complex.
I wish we could hear from everyone more, and yet the time is short and we are at the end of our time with this panel. I want to thank all of the panelists, and I especially want to thank the 70 viewers we had at the high point I noticed. Thanks everyone who wrote questions, even if we didn't get to you. And before I turn it over to President Debbie, I just wanted to echo James's comment at the opening of this panel that the vision for this conversation really came from our friend Barbara Ross. And she wanted to be sure that the League's commitment to justice, to supporting police oversight, carried on beyond one report that we wrote and beyond even her life. So I really hope we're making her proud tonight. She's on our hearts. Thank you all again for your questions and your thoughtful, compassionate answers. It's just an honor to share this screen with you. President Debbie Kay.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, James, and most especially, thank you, panelists. This has been an inspiring evening, and I truly regret that we are out of time. We could go on for a while learning more from you. You were stimulating and informative, each of you offering valuable and insightful learning, describing current successes, ongoing challenges, and potential pathways for increased success in this arena. We appreciate the critically important work that you are doing to address these vital community issues. I do want to note that the League of Women Voters attends the settlement agreement hearings and has provided testimony at those hearings on a frequent basis. The League of Women Voters is an organization that exists to empower civic engagement. You are part of a massive public community education process. We're grateful for your service and your dedication. Of course, I want to remind viewers and listeners about the importance of voting in the upcoming May 16th, 2023 special district election. This includes positions in community colleges, the Multnomah Education Service District, public schools, water and fire districts, and there will very likely be at least one ballot measure for Multnomah County as well. The last day to register to vote is April 25th. Please be sure and take care of that or update your registration if you have moved. Our League voter education resources will include candidate interviews on video and podcast, as well as the excellent nonpartisan website, vote411.org. Our next community education program will be in April on mental and behavioral health and related housing and homeless challenges. The League of Women Voters takes on big issues. We are inviting experienced leaders yet again to address this next important topic for our city. Thanks again to the League of Women Voters of Portland members for their generous support of this and all of our programs. As a reminder, links to review this program will be posted on our website, lwvpdx.org, around February 15th and available on various platforms as well as podcast. The League of Women Voters is a membership organization. We welcome you to join us. We will also value your financial support in presenting these and the other relevant programs that we offer to our community. Please see our membership and donor information page at lwvpdx.org. We hope you will join us for our next community education program in April. In the meanwhile, stay well, stay safe, and thank you for your support. Good night.